Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Peggy Parsons, Curator for Film, and I'd like to welcome you to the annual Rajiv Vaidya Lecture. The title this year is Noisy Archives and the Future of Memory, and our speaker is Rick Prelinger. But before I introduce Rick, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the friends and family of Rajiv Vaidya, several of whom are in the audience today, even though I can't see you right now because of the light in my eyes, but I know you're there. So it's through the generosity and kindness of them that this special fund was established in 2001 in order to provide a lasting, enriching, and communal tribute to Rajiv, who was very deeply interested in the history of cinema. So thank you. We're very, very grateful to have Rick Prelinger with us today. Rick wears many different hats. He's professor of film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's well known as an archivist, collector, filmmaker, author, and self-described outsider librarian. In 1982, he founded the Prelinger Archives to assure the preservation of ephemeral films and ephemeral movie footage. The definition of ephemeral in this case encompasses amateur and home movies, advertising and educational films, sponsored industrial and corporate films, and footage that's generally outside the scope of conventional study. In 2002, the Prelinger Archives was acquired by the Library of Congress. Many of these films were never actually submitted for copyright. Nearly half the collection is that's now in the library is unique master materials, and much of the rest of it is not really available in any other collection, so it's quite special. In 2004, he co-founded the Prelinger Library with Megan Prelinger, and he describes this as, quote, an appropriation-friendly and image-rich reference library specializing in 19th and 20th century historical ephemera. And the library, which is in San Francisco, where he lives, is in downtown San Francisco, and it's open to anyone. Besides UC Santa Cruz, Rick, who, by the way, grew up in DC, has taught in the MFA design program at the School of Visual Arts in New York. He lectures widely on American cultural and social history, and also cultural and intellectual property access. He sits on the National Film Preservation Board. He's board president of the Internet Archive and also the San Francisco Cinematheque. So after his lecture today and the Q&A, we'll have a short break, and then if you can stay around at 3:30, we're going to show his compilation called Lost Landscapes of New York, which, among other things, is a very special opportunity to hear Rick's live personal narration about what we are watching, and also a chance for you to talk out loud to the screen if you want to, so it's quite special. So please welcome Rick Prelinger.
Thank you, Peggy, for that detailed and considerably more incisive introduction than I usually get, so I appreciate that. I'm grateful thanks to the Vaidya family, whose generosity makes this whole lecture possible and the series of which it's a part. And thanks to everyone at the National Gallery, especially the technical crew whose kindness and labor comes together to make these programs. And thanks to all of you for coming today. I can't see you, so I'll have to find other ways to gauge your reaction to what I'm saying. What I'm going to talk about today I hope to venture beyond archives as we commonly think of them. And in so doing, I'm going to talk about ideas that really only probably a few hundred people are thinking about right now. So in a sense, this talk is a bit of an experiment. It's a bit of a provocation, and I hope to learn from your reactions. We commonly think of archives as repositories for the cultural, social, institutional, and family record, right? But rather, I want to propose today that we can begin with what we know and what we tend to take for granted about archives, about history, and about the turn to digital, and then go further. So today I'm going to try to take you on a short journey that is both contrarian and speculative. I hope you expect nothing less from a speaker. Today, archival materials permeate the culture, and old and new images intermix in our media and in our minds. Along with pretty much everything else, archives have moved from nerdy to chic, and history has moved into the mainstream. More people use archives and special collections, and most important of all, they're making many more derivative works from archival materials. It's tempting to say the internet made this all possible. But it isn't just because of the digital turn. It has to do with the way we think about history and the way that we feel perhaps more entitled to work with history than we might have a few years ago. But while archives have never been more popular, at the same time they're more precarious. Today's archivists must contend with weaponized amnesia, with scarce and uncertain resources, with technological change, and the flow from a relentless digital fire hose. This is the tweezer versus the shovel. These are two visions of digitality from the 50s. Was there ever a good time for the turn to digital? That's impossible to answer. But its disruptive effects are happening at the same time as all manner of cultural, social, and existential anxieties. Climate change. This is the California fires as seen, the sky as seen from my window, climate change, weather extremes, politics as performance, dramatic maldistribution of wealth and power, just to name a few, all coextensive with digital disruption. And digitality stops at nothing. Since the 1990s, we've steadily displaced much of our culture, labor, and record keeping from the physical to the digital domain. Sometimes this is simple as making a digital copy of a physical record. But more often it involves a complex reorganization of human activity, labor, and experience. This is an authentic, unrehearsed shot of opening up a box of home movies, and this is what I saw. To be fair, I need to credit the digital turn for my own emergence. My film archives were sequestered in metal cans sitting on high shelves in poorly lighted rooms. They were resistant to access. They were difficult to watch. They were unwieldy to repurpose. After it became more affordable to transfer, digitize, and later scan film straight to digital, we were able to make them available online for free downloading, viewing, and reuse. This changed my life, and I hope enabled the work of many makers who might not otherwise have been able to break through the commercial wall to get access to archival materials. I really can't think of any other archivist who's received the kind of validation that I have because of this. But not everyone's experience has been as positive as mine. Can we unequivocally say that digitality has changed our lives for the better? I don't know. While the digital turn has vastly enriched many of us, it's also amplified divides, accelerated inequalities, elevated the possibility of historical amnesia, and brought us new and onerous forms of labor. But while I recognize the drama of the digital turn, I want to stop short of using revolutionary language like my brothers and sisters in California have been doing for years. There is no light switch between past and future. Nothing is either old or new. Nothing's completely material or immaterial. This is the situation that the Welsh scholar Raymond Williams classically described, where the residual, what remains from the past, and the emergent, what's emerging from the future, coexist and interbreed. The residual and the emergent. This is especially true in media because the residual is often, sometimes always, emergent, and the emergent tends towards the residual. Old and new fuzz together. Think of that famous shot in Hitchcock's Vertigo that simultaneously zooms in and tracks backward. I hope I've got that right. Print is dying, but new forms are emerging. Old vinyl records are left on the street while new pressings are sold at premium prices. Film is simultaneously over and in resurgence. And like many technologies, digital technologies were introduced unevenly. They were at once there and not there. For many years, digital tech was associated with privilege. It took years for computers and broadband to percolate downward. Smartphones, even though they're expensive, pierced the wall. But even today, 11% of Americans don't use the internet. Digital isolation magnifies inequalities, though there are exceptions, such as the case of our president, who has reportedly never sent an email. The digital divide was, and still is, very real. But in recent years, we see two related trends. Groups of less powerful people have developed into technological vanguards. Two dramatic examples are youth, for whom the majority of online experiences are arguably designed, and African Americans, 91% of whom own smartphones, Asian Americans, 94%, Latinx people, 90%. What many people call Black Twitter is a cultural space for complex performance of identity, as well as a powerful tool for communication to make social change. And it's interesting that Black Twitter and white Twitter don't intersect very much. Think of who you follow. In a society that markets their images but limits their agency, these groups have taken on the symbolic domain and negotiated their own relationships with it. And sometimes these relationships are reverse images of those that exist in the social and political world. But at the same time, things get funny when people's agency is displaced into the symbolic domain. The old relationship between digitality and privilege is flipping, and the digital domain is increasingly associated with powerlessness. We're starting to see evidence of a reverse digital divide, getting the personal attention of a bureaucrat, collecting and touching artisanal objects, writing with a nice pen. These are privileged encounters. The rest of the world wrestles with touch-tone menus, disrespectful algorithms, indifferent online government services, and poorly designed websites. And slow media is coming back for some. Some friends are building an intentional community in Mendocino County on the Northern California coast. They've installed fiber on their farm, but it moves bits very slowly. And for a long time, they chose to keep their internet service up only between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. Inconvenience, but voluntary. Historical amnesia isn't new. It made our country possible. Amnesia enabled colonialism, and it also enables mass entertainment. And now amnesia has become weaponized. We've mass digitized millions of cultural objects, but many of us live in a world that rarely references ideas or events back beyond 1997. And even though historical consciousness feels as if it's never been more urgent, we've taken the urgency out of history. We target historical books and programming to males 45 and older. There's a joke at PBS that's 45 to infinity. I don't know if there's anybody here from PBS who can attest to that, but there's almost no historical programming that's targeted at emergent youth. A browser architecture. Your browser does a good job of presenting small pieces of historical insight and small bites of evidence, but it hasn't yet worked out presenting complex texts or ideas, and neither have most documentary films, frankly. Perhaps we'll rediscover history if a crisis makes it clear that we can't find all the answers in the present. I don't know. We've also invented new forms of digital labor that insidiously mask the distinction between work and leisure. I toggle seamlessly between work I'm accountable for and the maintenance of my social media personality. One mode is paid, the other unpaid, but it all takes place in the same machine space and mobilizes the same mind and body functions. Both tire me. And as we all know, my digital leisure creates great value for businesses that will indirectly sell me back my labor that's built into goods and services that I buy. And the digital turn has brought about new injuries and caused many of us to experience old wounds in new ways. They're the workers who once worked with physical objects whose labor and skills are no longer needed. There's the loss of countless library books and other textual materials that are no longer accessible in their original forms. Now we only see pictures of them, and the ease of digital access is often countered by an infinitely harder use experience. You know, it's as if You couldn't see paintings, only books. There's the trauma re-experienced by cultures that have been marginalized for many years and are now exposed on the internet in ways over which they have no control. I'm thinking here especially about indigenous cultures whose traditional knowledge is shared in ways that violate custom and taboo. And there's everything we read about in the press: trolling, the harassment of women and peoples of color, the mass propagation of lies. None of this new, but accelerated and amplified to an unprecedented scale. This is what I mean when I talk of digital wounds. But now let's talk about a clean and spare world. Digital emergence has given birth to a sense that we've moved beyond the era in which information and culture is principally embodied in physical objects. Digital emergence, we might say that it rests on kind of the assumption of analog marginality. It's very binary, it's either or. And some librarians and archivists are tasked by their managers to clear shelves of rarely consulted physical materials. This is real shelf clearing, and it's deeply destructive. Here are some examples of inconvenient media objects that are disappearing from libraries and archives. Many have already disappeared. The one at the bottom, film, is only beginning to disappear, but I believe it will. I mean, to be fair, quite often the decision to digitize and destroy, or simply to deaccession, is reasonable. In itself, it's not a poor decision, but we have to reckon with the sum of many decisions that profoundly change the way we connect with cultures. There's all kinds of anxieties that coalesce in this drive to divest ourselves of the physical. For some, the turn to digital is a turn to purity, a turn away from inconvenient, old, disease-ridden, culturally infected objects. Of course, digital materials themselves are neither pure nor clean. They rot, they drop out, they glitch, they fall victim to format obsolescence. We don't yet know how to preserve digital materials in the long run. Anyone who tells you they do is pitching a product, probably. And the companies that we trust to maintain many of our digital materials move on. They disappear. There are worries about clutter, about hoarding. Most normative images of living, working, and communal spaces today show environments that are spare and open. Storage is rationed, physical storage, and since most storage is assumed to be digital, it's generally invisible. Media scholar Erica Midglin, I think an unsung genius, remarks on how we stigmatize physical accumulation, but we reward digital hoarding. Scott Herring's excellent book, The Hoarders, which unsolicited pitch, go out and buy it. It's a great read. The Hoarders talks at length about how hoarding is stigmatized and equated with mental distress, and he tries to bring us back down to earth a little bit. We cannot let today's ideas of clutter overdetermine tomorrow's access to history. More fundamentally, our attitudes towards material objects have become infected with what historians call presentism. We are presentist when we apply current modes of thinking to the past and the future. Right now, it's very tempting to eternalize the present and to imagine a future that's based on trends that are very young, that haven't been with us for very long. It's presentism, for example, to regard digitality as the absolute negation of physical media. And so I love to ask this question: do physical cultural objects have the right to exist? It's an interesting question. This, by the way, I didn't make this up. Somebody did that. That was a prank. This is one of the machines at the Internet Archive that holds hard drives, and when you go to archive.org, they spin for you. The crisis ecosystem of evidence-bearing physical objects has become really fascinating. There's a displacement, an expulsion of physical materials in favor of digital surrogates. It's akin to urban gentrification. And as archivists, scholars, and citizens, one day we're going to have to answer for it. We're basing entire new agendas, phenomenological, philosophical, scholarly agendas, on one recent technological turn, the turn to digital. And for some reason, we find ourselves staging a battle against physical materials in order to make room for apparent digital abundance. But the record of daily life and ephemeral print culture can be an inclusive record of the experience of communities often left out of mainstream histories. It's the record of people and what they read, saw, and heard. Much of this record is physical. It's expensive to take care of. And questions of equity surround the decisions to collect or not to collect, to retain or to divest. Every generation, every community should have the right to access, assimilate, study, and critique the cultural heritage that surrounds them. If I knew what I was doing when we started the online film archives, which I can't really claim I knew what I was doing, but in the back of my mind was this sense that every generation had the right to rethink the cultural heritage and history of the United States through these films, and we had to make them available. The freedom to uncollect is asymmetric. Those whose cultures are effaced by uncollecting generally have no say in the matter. And by the way, download that poster, it's a great read. Digital and physical materials defamiliarize one another. And for me, this goes a long way to explain the value of physical materials and why both belong together. Defamiliarization means making the familiar strange so that we can see it with new eyes. It means seeing something in a different context. It's like bringing your partner home to the parents for the first time, or letting a dog loose to run in the waves, and suddenly you see a wild animal. Physical objects are remembrance objects. They're reminders of how systems of communication, representation, information, and labor function and still work. And interestingly enough, it's taken the aggressive onset of digitality to teach us more about how physical materials work, about their specific affordances, about what physical materials make possible. So 3 experiences that I've been involved in to help us maybe look beyond simple physical, virtual binaries to redistribute power and heal digital wounds. This is a little preview from Lost Landscapes of New York later on today. This is 42nd and 8th in 1946. I'd like to cite my own experiences here. The 3 projects I'll mention are not necessarily world-changing models, but they've taught me a great deal about the potential of passing on knowledge in both digital and physical modes. It is not easy to model new worlds, but the cultural space is wide open for remodeling. For example, we can model new modes of cultural distribution that will give us a hint at what new modes of property distribution might look like. We might also tackle enhancing public memory through restructuring public archives. So, archives. During the 1980s, I collected a couple 100,000 cans of historical film. I supported this collection by charging people to use stock footage, which was generally successful, but there was a big problem. Film is terribly inconvenient. Those of you who've worked with film know about the distance between the can and everything else you want to do. It's hard to bridge that gap between the object and the people who need or want to use it. It's smelly, it's heavy, it takes expensive machinery to duplicate. But when I returned to California in 1999, I was almost immediately drawn into an emergent digital culture that was nothing like my previous experience in New York, where information still wanted to be expensive. When in the first 30 seconds of our acquaintance, Brewster Kahle, the founder of Internet Archive, challenged me to digitize our collection and put it online, I was at first wary, but soon enthusiastic. The experience of offering a large collection, which is now almost 7,000 items for unlimited and free reuse, dramatically changed my life. It gave me a perspective that doesn't fit neatly into the dominant discourses of archival practice and librarianship. Because suddenly anyone could download a file, play it, share it, or incorporate images and sounds into their own work. This has now been done some hundreds of millions of times, and there's absolutely no way to estimate how many new works, how many derivative works have been made with a collection. We breached that commercial wall I mentioned that separates users and would-be makers from history. The film collection is now at Library of Congress, as Peggy mentioned, where it will survive as long as any film survives, but the digital versions circulate without limits. There's a lot more to say about this project, but for now, I think it's a really successful encounter and mixing of the physical and the digital. This is our library in San Francisco. There are other kinds of sharing. The experience of giving away films helped us imagine a different kind of library. And so my partner, Megan, and I tried the experiment of opening our collection of printed materials to the public in 2004. This project continues, and we have space through the end of 2021, and we've had time to learn a great deal. What we've learned, the library has become a workshop for social reading and collaborative work. It's incubated countless works of art, publications, events, research projects. And the key idea that this suggests is tied to the maker movement, but it's not quite like it. That many cultural institutions might gain by thinking of themselves not as repositories, but as workshops, as places where new work is made from old collections. And unusually for a collection of print, right? Dusty books, periodicals, and print ephemera, our patrons skew young. They're mostly between 18 and 35. Some of the things that happen at the library. Our interest in starting the library was to build community, though we had no idea how this might happen. And as it turned out, community did build around the collection. We don't think our main achievement has been to build a collection, though it's kind of become a great collection. It's fostering the growth of community. We see about 1,200 visitors a year, and over 200 people support the library financially through contributions. We don't subsidize it anymore. We think that in these times, touching, browsing, and reading books has become a privileged experience. I grew up around huge book collections. Relatively few people do now. We've scanned a lot, it's online, and interestingly enough, people use the physical shelves as the index to the digital corpus, which is a kind of neat rehearsal of common behavior. So the lesson of the archives and the library, one is exclusively digital, the other is resolutely analog, leads me to believe that the most exciting course to the future lies in both and, in embracing digital-physical hybridity as an active and inclusive practice, neither one nor the other, both and. As at our library, we found that our younger visitors find many research hooks in materials that other libraries have junked. Popular and trade periodicals, gov documents, paper maps, print ephemera. We often need to put resources in front of people and say, look at this, but the value is constantly reconfirmed that these objects have the right to exist. These young men are looking at the Census Atlas of 1890, produced by the Bureau of the Census, which has a deep concern with race and religion. Take a look at it sometime. It's a deep object that's been junked by many libraries. Public assembly. So it doesn't make much sense to talk about, well, neither nostalgia for the physical nor the celebration of digital conquest make a lot of sense. To take a formulation from the artist and writer Jen Bervin and transcode it, it's becoming clear that physical and digital materials each have different jobs to do. And in fact, the turn to digital has revalidated the analog. Digital media has taught us a great deal about how physical media forms actually work. Ebooks have taught us to think more about how physical books work. Weavers today take inspiration from screens. And as Austrian film curator Alex Horvat has pointed out, the renaissance of Baroque-era musical instruments is a relatively recent phenomenon. So there's this kind of reverse validation, this reverse understanding where the future elucidates the past. What does public assembly mean? So those of you who stay till 3:30 will experience this directly, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about it for those of you who can't. When you successfully bring together people in a room, what more could you do than just show a film? This is a topic I've been quite interested in because it seems like you could do a lot more than just show a movie. Since 2006, I've produced 25 feature-length urban history events. in San Francisco, Detroit, Oakland, LA, and New York. Each one of these events, which is in quote, I say event instead of film, brings together archival footage from home movies, studio-produced outtakes, industrial films, newsreels, and other kind of rarely seen ephemera. The audience is encouraged to talk as the event unfolds, to identify people, places, and events, to ask questions, to disagree with your neighbors, comment freely. I'm also the MC. These revel in images of the past, but these are non-nostalgic projects. I want people to think about possible urban futures. They avoid narrative, they avoid the character-driven structures that we associate with mainstream documentary, but they're quite intricate. They've been performed over 100 times in various cities. They've been seen by about 38,000 spectator/participants. And and this is critical, there's a lot of new work in interactive and participatory documentary right now, but my work is realized through public assembly rather than algorithm. People are not separated by machines. For a time, I thought I was doing something radical, but I soon realized this is completely traditional. In the West, think of the Elizabethan theater, where the pits were often said to be populated by rowdy groundlings who commented loudly on plays and performers. This is a highly engaged form of audience interactivity. And later, the theatrical space functioned as a virtual stage onto which racially integrated audiences in the 19th century especially performed social relations. As Elizabeth Maddock Dillon describes in a wonderful book, the deterritorialized common lands, when they were taken away from the people, they were remapped into the space of the theater, so that 18th and early 19th century audience members didn't just go to the theater to see a play. They went to represent themselves, to make common space and often common cause. In 1804, a Boston writer complained that the theater didn't have bright enough lighting during the show because people weren't there just for the performance. And when Richard III was performed at the Bowery Theater in New York in 1832, over 300 audience members swarmed the stage to assist in slaying the tyrannical king. So this is, not your multiplex where they tell you to turn your phone off. These are quintessential digital projects. They couldn't exist without digital scanning, editing, and projection, and their high definition. Yet they're made from completely analog sources. They encourage people to raise their voices in the presence of many others. They require making the effort to come out to the theater, but perhaps they lead us back to a commons. So a few lessons. We cannot exclusively thrive in either analog or digital worlds. We might therefore try to think about what it might mean to be radically traditionalist, to exploit the possibilities of physical and digital hybridity and materiality as a way of remediating our sort of poorly thought out rush to the digital. This doesn't mean rejecting technology. This is not your Sunday afternoon Luddite speech. It might mean using technology with greater imagination. Do we simply retain physical objects? Well, physical objects have great psychological and symbolic power, but their existence alone is not enough to affect power relationships. But objects can be shared, they can be loaned and exchanged, they can be the basis for performance and social activity. Community can coalesce around collections. We might begin by trying to sort of avoid binary thinking and thinking beyond polarities. How could we migrate this consciousness of hybridity into every aspect of our digital lives? Could we use hybridity as a strategy for confronting power that manifests digitally? Could we leverage the reverse digital divide and try to share physical goods as broadly as we now distribute digital goods? Could we not only use digital and analog to defamiliarize one another, but to defamiliarize the idea of virtual versus physical property? One thing is clear, that to embrace analog-digital hybridity means honoring the dignity and the labor of those who work and who maintain in all modes. It also means learning from makers in all media and all materials. It means resisting a shift of consciousness into exclusively digital metaphors and promoting ways of thinking that emanate out of physical making as well. And it means maintaining the records of our time in both analog and digital forms. It means being conscious of physical place and what it means to people, combating the celebration of placelessness. The left picture is people who might have been resisting the redevelopment of their neighborhood on the Upper West Side. It means looking up from our keyboards and seeing who and what are around us. We might avoid writing triumphalist narratives in advance. Many of us seem to be celebrating the total victory of the digital, even though this hasn't yet occurred. How often have we heard that we'll achieve infinite cultural memory? But why save everything just because we might aspire to do so? There's been news in recent years about DNA-based storage, which is working. It's very slow, but it's working. It suggests that all human knowledge can be preserved in about 6 wine bottles worth of DNA. People at Microsoft Research must have gone to a French restaurant for lunch the day they wrote that press release. But universal storage is the greatest machine for forgetting that humans ever could imagine, because the ability to remember invents the right to forget. I think this is the best photograph I've ever taken. I just come in right out and say that. Ultimately, our era will not be judged simply by the evanescent digital monuments we build, but also by the measurable success of what we can fix and invent and introduce in the physical world. You know, there's really exciting and important data-driven projects, large-scale modeling, astrophysics and cosmology, but the huge projects go far beyond moving bits around, climate change, redistributing resources, and so on. And finally, we need to think differently about archives. Could we start to think about archives not as places where the record of the past quietly rests, but where the reality of the future waits to break free? To sort of paraphrase and borrow a bit from the brilliant digital humanist Bethany Novisky, what if we saw archives not just as anchorages, but also launch pads? What if we saw archives not simply as spaces for retrospect, but spaces for rehearsal? Could we think about archives and other cultural repositories as speculative places where we can imagine, craft, and criticize different ways of making community and society? Could we make that twist where we don't just look to archives for the record of the past, but where we imagine and create the record of the future? To me, this can work because archives are both repositories of trails followed and roads not taken. We can look to archives for evidence that helps us rethink the way our world has turned out, and we can find many intimations of alternate worlds. Archives resist triumphalist visions of progress. They support us when we question whether what we now experience is inevitable. Archives help us question whether the future has to be what we are told it will be. And at their best, I think archives can be places where we might try to model alternative and utopian arrangements of society. And the reason I think this works is because we look to archives as ways they record social arrangements and how they've turned out. The record that's held in archives helps us recover and evaluate different sorts of social experiments. Could we not think of archives as places where social arrangements are perhaps drafted and worked out? We see this today in what a number of Afrofuturist thinkers are proposing regarding historical archives, that we might think of archives as containers for utopian worlds that have never yet come to pass. This is true also in community archives projects where alternative social arrangements are recorded and documented. Just as a painting, a work of speculative fiction, or an experimental music composition leads us to imagine unanticipated futures, we could also imagine them in the archives or in the museum. We do this by rediscovering and reconsidering the past through its evidence and looking to the evidence for intimations, for hints of futures. And today, we see that archives are becoming more than just collecting institutions. They're becoming noisy sites where community conversations transform into theory. This is another quote from Bethany Novisky. She says, "Let's move digital libraries and archives past the stage of lenses for retrospect and become spaces for projection, planning, performance, speculation." She talks about how Afrofuturist thinking proposes counterinsurgencies to inevitability and points to projects like Black Quantum Futurism in Philadelphia, led by Rashida Phillips and Moore Mother. Very interesting, worth looking at. And where I started thinking this way, I was really prompted in 2014 by communities of archivists and thinkers who were generating a wealth of new thought about what archives are and what they could be, notably feminist identified archivists, archivists of color, some queer theorists and community activists, people who focus on the future of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expression in a highly networked world. So much of the current excitement in the archives field stems from the Black Lives Matter movement, which posed an incredible challenge. This important movement that has left such a trace. It's mostly recorded in social media. And social media is hard to save. It can be dangerous to save. It's certainly complicated to save. It proposes really a whole new set of questions. But archivists like Jared Drake, Burgess Jules, Era Tanzi, Bethany Novisky, Stacey Williams, Ricky Punzalan, a host of others are proposing radical archival figurings. For example, they're saying, let's think about community-driven needs rather than just research needs. So archives are becoming birthplaces of new ideas whose implications go way beyond just how to collect records, how to make them accessible. The community-based record, the informal record, in this case the home movie record, can be so revealing and so important, and we're only beginning to look at it. This is the Slaby family of Detroit, who in 1959, along with the rest of the white people, left their neighborhood when it was blockbusted by corrupt realtors who said, "You better sell quick, the so-called colored are moving in." And so they shot this movie because they were home movie freaks, of almost every house on their block up for sale. In 1959, 1960, when I first showed this in Detroit, I met an African-American woman who said, "We moved in there." So the oceans are rising. And if archives are to ride the waves, it's not going to be as arcs that are fully caulked to repel leaks, but as permeable wetlands that are capable of assimilating ebbs and flows. Archives as venues where past, present, and future interchange and transform one another. In this, I think, lies their greatest purpose, an occasion for excitement. And the digital turn was never inevitable. It arose through a combination of invention, arrangement, and social needs. It promised people many conveniences and also promised great returns to the businesses that wanted to engage us. It could have happened otherwise, and there will be other tech revolutions that make the digital turn seem trivial. It is trendy to assert that the digital-physical conflict will inevitably resolve in favor of the digital. But victory is written neither in stone nor in bits, as we continue to realize that production and public discourse and social struggle don't easily shift from messy and inconvenient realities into symbolic domains. We'll begin to reconnect what we've so conveniently severed. And I end with Nathaniel Hawthorne, with his story Earth's Holocaust, one of the greatest anti-archival tales that begins once upon a time, but whether in the time past or the time to come is a matter of little or no moment. This wide world had become so overburdened with an accumulation of worn-out trumpery that it's a coincidence that the inhabitants determined to rid themselves of it by a general bonfire. Hawthorne imagines a moment when the world wants to clean itself out, to purge itself of its past, and builds a giant bonfire. It's a great story. It's public domain. You can easily find it. Hawthorne is careful to say that intellect itself cannot serve for humans to distinguish right from wrong. Has the digital turn encouraged librarians and cultural custodians and decision makers to channel this ethic? Purification through simplification? Has the iPhone doing the same thing? None of us can look just to emerging technology or just to ourselves to inform the decisions as to what we keep, what we throw away, what we pay attention to. We need to look to our communities and to the futures that we hope to build. Thank you for your attention.